a privilege to have an opportunity to present for the RAS here tonight, especially when I'm talking about a topic which includes several surprising connections to the this very society, as we will see later in this. As we. As we will see later in this lecture, so I'm very pleased to be here. So of course, I really love this picture, don't you think? It's kind of cute picture. So the title of this lecture is just pretty self-explanatory, as you can see. I'll be talking about the earliest recordings of commercial Korean music made in 1906. By Columbia and Victor Company, arguably the biggest recording giants of the world at the first half of the 20th century. But before we start talking about these actual recordings, I'm going to also talk about some of the history of the sound recording in general, as well as the introduction of the sound recording technology to Korea in the 1890s and onward, to give you an idea of why it's so significant about to have such a to have this recording here. So in the beginning, Thomas A. Edison invented the phonograph in 1877, but when it was first invented in 1877, it was a very crude machine. It made sound recordings by indenting, making indentations on top of a piece of tin foil, which you glue on a rotating mandrel, and obviously you hand crank it, so it makes the sound very tinny and wobbly and largely unintelligible, and it could not play multiple times. Once you play it once, yeah, it happens. Yeah, once it was played back once or twice, and it was completely over. You couldn't play it back. It was not lasting long enough. So Edison saw no future to it and put it aside and went out to invent light bulbs as we know it. But after about 10 years, when a bunch of people, a bunch of scientists and mechanics and machinists tried to improve his favorite baby, as he later called it, he decided to make it commercially available again, and after much improvements, he finally came up with the machine you see over here and on the left here, the phonograph. So these machines used phonograph cylinders. They were first made in wax, and later it was made in celluloid. So it was recorded vertically, and hill and dale method. So and it could do both recording and sound and playback as well at the same time by just simply switching these heads in front of it, and which I'm going to demonstrate later in our lecture. So I'm going to play a little bit of a snippet of how it actually should sound like. So I'm going to do a little bit of a demonstration first and move on. The recording you're hearing is from 1909. It's about 110 years almost. It's pretty crisp and clear. The song is By the Light of the Silver Moon, which was the big hit in 1909. It's kind of a little cute song, but anyway. So somebody remembers it? of that. So anyway, so this was basically how people, listened to like sound recordings in the early 1890s and onward. But while Edison was minding his light bulb business and didn't do much of anything in the 1880s to improve this technology, as I said, many early other scientists, including Alexander Graham Bell and a bunch of others, tried to improve the sound recording technology to a more advanced and more durable way. So in 1886, there was this German immigrant mechanic living in Washington, D.C. by the name of Emil Berliner. And he improved, after much consideration, he decided the best way to mass produce sound recordings and preserve it was to flatten out the cylinder. In other words, you make a recording on a rotating disc. So he called this technology the gramophone in 1887, 10 years after the initial invention of the phonograph. So it used a flat disc, as we all see, and it was also laterally recorded. So the cylinders went this way, vertically, but it was a disc actually were recorded sideways here. So it was not, of course, interchangeable, but anyway, but it could be, it could be mass-produced as they called it, was like waffle iron. It happened again, but again. But not only it is significant in many ways, it could be mass-produced and cheaper and louder and could record more longer music on it. It basically served as a precursor to any kind of modern format that uses round flat disc, starting with modern vinyls, LPs and DVDs and CDs and Blu-rays, all of which have basically the same principle. So to give you an idea how it actually improved over 20-odd years, this is the typical example of a gramophone from the 1930s, which I'm going to play again. This is obviously a French recording. Has some Gaelic charm into it. It's from the early 1930s. So there you have it. So these are two different types of technology as we had it. The big problem, the disadvantage of the gramophone technology was that it was only capable of playing pre-recorded discs. So you could not record on it like the cylinders you can do on cylinders, as we will see later in our demonstration. But so naturally, the gramophone and disc system, but eventually took over, because the recordings, as I said, could be cheaply mass-produced, and from the very beginning. So that's basically why we don't make any distinctions between the word phonograph and gramophone, at least in the U.S. English, because Edison's phonograph simply died out, and it was futile just to make any meaningful distinctions between the two. So, because of these a series of international patent rights, only 3 companies, I repeat 3 companies, the Gramophone Company, later Gramophone and Typewriter Company, which later became EMI, in London, England, and its American affiliate, the Victor Talking Machine Company of Camden, New Jersey, and the Columbia Graphophone Company, which was their bitter rival. They really fight over like cats and dogs for the first half of the 20th century. That's always what they did. You can write a book about it. But anyway, these 3 companies, only 3 companies had exclusive worldwide legal rights to produce disc recordings until the late 1900s, 19 teens, until the Berliner's patent initially got expired. But anyway, before 1912, like when it was finally expired, these three companies were the only companies who could legally produce these discs. So, which created a huge worldwide monopoly. As I said, I just described the phonograph and the gramophone technology. But so when it comes to like Korean situation, guess which one came first in this country? Anyone? Gramophone or phonograph? It was obviously, actually, the phonograph which came into this country for the first time. There has been quite a lot of speculations and like urban legends and everything about who introduced it first to this country. And there has been so many like variants about it, so you can even follow the whole thing. But I actually I myself actually made a recent discovery from the paper collections of the Thomas A. Edison National Historic Site in Orange, New Jersey, where they have tons of like literally thousands and literally millions of papers, like paper trail of the Edison Corporation when Thomas Edison was alive. And I discovered a series of articles and like documents and letters and receipts and so forth that reveals the very first instance wherein the sound recording technology first came to Korea. So in February 1890, this was like about a year or so after the first commercially available phonograph was put on the market. Everett Fraser, an American merchant and who also served as a consul general for Korea in New York, he was into like selling electric appliances and wires and so forth. He was also responsible for having the very first electric light bulbs in Korea in Gyeongbokgung in 1887. He arranged a deal with Thomas A. Edison and to make special presentation phonographs and donate them to the eminent people of the Orient, which included Emperor Meiji of Japan and General Ri Hong-jang of China and the King of Korea, i.e. Gojong. So for promotional purposes, the idea, of course, is that he wanted to have their hearts on this new invention so that they can endorse it and that will be available, make it available to sell to these countries. So Fraser then met Horace Allen. Most of you who attended this lecture would know who he was, and he was, of course, was also involved in RAS early on. Who was visiting the U.S. for his missionary affairs. Fraser called him to his office and taught him how to operate the phonograph. And Fraser made Allen to present the machine to the king, Gojong, which he did in June or July of 1890. We have all these letters coming from it. However, whatever became of this phonograph after that is not known. There's no Korean sources about this donation, and I have a feeling that I know about these machines, and these machines were battery driven, and in order to get it running, you have to put the battery liquid every 72 hours, which were sulfuric acid. So I have a hunch that this thing wouldn't probably have lasted long after initially introduced in this country. But whatever became of it, I have no idea. But the paper trail unfortunately ends there. But at least I can quite conclusively prove that this is the very first instance when the sound technology first came to Korea for the first time. So to give you an idea, here's one of the papers that I discovered, and you can see in here His Majesty the King of Korea with compliments of the inventor Thomas A. Edison here. So if this is supposed to be this commemorative plaque that would have been installed in front of the machine. So this is one of the very I'm working on an article which would discuss all these new findings, and we'll be hopefully can publish it sometime later this year. However, there are so we don't know anything about whatever happened to these machines, but there's these machines. But as like we still have a recording. We still have a recording of a Korean language made in the 1890s. This is the earliest extant Korean recording of any kind, and it was recorded by this individual, pioneering anthropologist and ethnomusicologist by the name of Alice Cunningham Fletcher. And she studied the Native American culture, and one of the big breakthrough that she did was to make recordings on like wax cylinders and later transcribe them on taking notes and transcribing on the modern musical notation system. So on July 24th, 1896. 3 Korean students who were attending Howard University in Washington, D.C. was brought over Fletcher's house, and they were encouraged to make recordings. And it was mostly spoken word and like a little bit of songs and ditties, nursery rhymes, and anything they could think of. So basically, it's not clear why she wanted to make sound recordings of Korean language. It has been suggested that it had been some suggestions made by her friend, Anna Tolman Smith, who was a pedagogist interested in foreign students and the like. But anyway, the fact of the matter is we still have 6 cylinders made in this occasion way back in 120 years ago. And we, as I said, 3 students were known to have made these recordings. We know 2 of them. We managed to identify 2 of these people. An Jung-sik and Yi Hee-chul, who are actually standing in this photograph, 2 of these people. So we don't really know whatever happened to who is the 3rd person who actually recited into the cylinder. But so we do need some more research to be done. These original cylinders were donated after she passed away in 1923. These were donated to the U.S. Library of Congress and has been sitting there in the shelf for about 70 years. And in the process, in the total neglect and everything, these fragile wax cylinders, 2 of them were broken. So it's making them basically unplayable. But in 1998, Dr. Robert Probine, from University of Maryland, who happens to be a RAS member as well, he discovered these cylinders recordings for the first time in 1998, and it has been reissued on a CD and has been available quite a number of times. And there were at least 2 TV documentaries about these findings. To actually see these cylinders in last September when I was doing a project for the Dongryugyongwan, the Independence Hall Museum of Korea, and I just happened to have this particular cylinder in my hand, which was literally having a holy grail in my hand. This is arguably as I said, the priceless artifact from in terms of sound recording technology. So I'm going to play a little bit of a snippet from this cylinder, the very cylinder I'm actually holding. We can try it again. This is a nursery rhyme. Da 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 da. Yeah. this is the entire content of that particular cylinder that I'm holding. But anyway, there are, yeah, it's not much of a musical performance if you ask me, but it's just like somebody reciting this, like,
What year was that?
What?
What year was that?
1896, as I said. So, which makes it, as I said, the earliest extant recording of any musical, like, content of a Korean language.
Any sound you retrieve from the broken cylinder, or is it completely?
There are like 8 seconds. So yeah, it starts with like this, like doing some rhythm with clapping the hands, but it cuts off. So we don't really, and the chunk is missing. So if you have a chunk like that missing chunk and you could put it together, you can actually piece it together right now. But because of the neglect of these entire collection, this was literally sitting in a basement for 60 years. They didn't do anything to it, so a lot of them got, not just the Korean ones, but all these Native American ones are also like deteriorated like significantly. But that happens with big library collections when they don't really, keep on track. So anyway, so by 1897, many foreigners, including missionaries like William Arthur Noble and Horace Allen, if it's really his. I mean, not the one that donated to the Kojong. I don't know whatever happened to it. But these people were known to have either phonographs or gramophones. It's either which or which. Of course, gramophones were cheaper, so many missionaries were actually actually had gramophones rather than phonographs. The only person that I found who actually had a phonograph was Allen. So, yeah, he was rich. So, but I couldn't find any Korean individual who actually owned a machine personally for his personal use at this time. You can find some references about these people by around 1903, 1904. But by 1899, what I could find was that several Koreans, like businessmen, they began to establish what they called 유성기 처소, or phonograph parlors. It basically is like you have 1 or 2 phonographs in front of the shop, and you have the spectators, and you collect money from your spectators and play these like little bit of snippets of these machine playing music for the first time, and it was such a novelty at the time. And this was not Korea was not the only place where they had this kind of places. I mean, in the United States, they had millions of these things, millions of these places, establishments, and Europe. And that photograph is from Japan around the same time, 1898, about a year before. But you can still see there's a phonograph here, and you can clearly see some people are listening to it. Sometimes they use loud horn, like to make it sound. The sound, let the sound go through, but as you can see, these people are listening to ear tubes, like earpiece. Like it's basically like listening tubes that are connected to the machine, so that so you have to pay for it to hear it, basically, to use that earpiece. So
speak close to the microphone.
Yeah. So not only that, we also have. Newspaper clipping, a very interesting newspaper article from 독립신문, or the Independent, from April 20th, 1899, and it mentions a banquet hosted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 외부, and when they had a phonograph to play, and later in that banquet it says when they brought over a group of musicians hired for this occasion, and they were encouraged to make these sound recordings right on the site, suggesting they were actually using phonographs here, like cylinder phonographs I'm talking. And so the question is, of course, how these machines actually were brought over this country. And the answer is from China most of the time in these early years. The word itself, like to describe the machine, 유성기, literally meaning talking machine. This word has Chinese origin, and we also have several like newspaper like advertisements from Chinese merchants based in Incheon and Busan and elsewhere that mentions about phonographs as their items that they sell in their stores. So and also several newspaper reports from the early 1900s and onward. They also mentions about like making like an instance of making cylinder recordings of Korean music, and there is also a reminiscence of this early 20th century musician by the name of Park Chun-jae, who claimed to have made recordings for for Gojong when in the early 1900s. Now it has a lot of embellishments, and he claims that a lot of things that's simply not true. But there are it does reveal that there has been quite a lot of attempts by the Koreans to make make recordings of their own music on this new medium. But unfortunately, because these wax cylinders are so fragile, they were very prone to break. They have a tendency to have mold grew on the surface, destroying the recording. So far as I can tell, there has been no surviving examples of these early Korean-made recordings from this period. And by 1904 and 1905, people started to, several trading companies based in Japan, either Japanese-owned trading companies or had some companies that had connections with the Japanese dealers. They began to supply gramophones, disc machines, as well. And of course, I have a speculation that the reason for it was that to compete against the Chinese merchants at the time who were selling phonographs instead of gramophones. So try to compete against with competing technology. But however, the big problem, of course, was that, remember, as I said earlier, that these disc gramophones could only play pre-recorded music. So and obviously lacked software. I would say software. Of course, the word is recent, but it obviously lacked the software for Koreans, commercial disc recordings of Korean music, available at this time. So it posed quite a lot of interesting problems for all these record companies. Remember these three companies I mentioned earlier? These companies were eager to have expand their market to non-European or American market, but of course they had nothing to offer at this point. So as a result, they decided to have what they called recording expeditions. So it's a very grand name, but so in reality, it basically means that they actually sent these recording engineers to these remote places in Asia, in various parts of Asia and South America and all these different places, to make these recordings of these local talents and ship the masters back to the head office in anywhere, like in Europe or US, and produce them for the commercial use. So the very first occasion when this happened was in 1902, in September 1902, when Frederick W. Geisberg. It sounds German, but he was American. He was a second-generation German immigrant. So he's a pioneering recording engineer working for the Gramophone and Typewriter company. His biggest scoop, at this time, by 1902, he was already on the road for about 2.5 years, and recording all kinds of celebrity talents, for mostly classical and operatic talents. His biggest scoop was the famous Enrico Caruso, the great operatic tenor. He is the very first person who recorded him for the first time. But so he was very good. He showed premises for doing this task, this Herculean task. First of all, this recording apparatus of the period, it weighed about 120 kilograms and 260 pounds. And because it was weight driven, it had a weight driven motor. It did not have any electricity with it. And plus, you had to have thousands of these fragile wax tablets, to make recordings on. So you have literally he had to go with a ton of equipment and machines to go with. But he proved himself to be quite worthy of this task for 2.5 years. So the company decided to send him to all different parts of Asia. So starting in September 1902, Geisberg visited Calcutta, India, starting with that, and made all kinds of recordings from India and the Straits. I'm talking about Singapore and Malay, and went to Japan, China, and Thailand. In the times between, he also recorded some Tibetan music as well. like, can you imagine? I mean, like bringing all these heavy equipment all the way to Tibet. That would be like great task, but he was all by himself. He only had 2 other assistants to go with him. They were literally his porters. But anyway, so and of course he had some fun in Japan, as you can see in this photograph. But so he managed to make within about a year in between in his time in Asia, he managed to make about 1,700 recordings in 16 different languages, which is a great accomplishment, of course. And of course, it resulted in a huge commercial success for the company. And this commercial success.
Sorry to interrupt. Are these on the fragile?
Like these are so they recorded. What they did was like they made original recordings on the wax tablet, wax plate. They shipped them back to the UK, and they electroplated to make a metal part, a metal stamper to press records, and they pressed them. So it was a great deal amount of work. And of course, the safety was always a big concern because these things were very fragile. But anyway, this commercial success of this expedition eventually led these competitors to initiate their own version of recording expeditions, and around 1903. And of course, though the Gramophone and Typewriter company managed to have a lead on this expeditions, there are many other competitors. However, the problem, of course, was that Geisberg, obviously, or anybody who was involved in this recording record making at the time, they were all Americans. They were young. They had no special training whatsoever to understand the music or anything. So they lacked absolutely they had no understanding of the non-European recording. Like music or like anything, language, so forth. And they occasionally made quite a lot of racist remarks. And this is a passage from Geisberg's own diary from 1903 when he was visiting Japan. He said, "Japanese music is simply too horrible, but funny to relate. To me, it sounded like a donkey brain." So that's how he felt about it. This obviously, of course, meant that if you have no understanding of the music, obviously you cannot find any talent to make a suitable commercially available, a commercially viable product. So this always meant that the recording engineers had to contact an intermediary between them and the locals, or either consumers or the talents itself. These intermediaries, of course, also acted as a talent scout. Both acted as a talent scout as well as a sales agent at the time. So we don't have that much of information about these intermediaries. We do have some of them, some of these people do have their names on their diaries and journals, but we don't really know much about them except just one individual here. This case of Japan. So here's this really fascinating individual by the name of Henley Black. He was born in Australia, and he came to Japan at the age of 6 when his father was appointed as an editor for this English newspaper in Yokohama. So he came to Japan in the early Meiji period, and he obviously picked up Japanese. He became fluent. He became a native to it. And he worked with this newspaper, and he also worked as an English instructor, like everybody does. But by 1890s, he was no longer needed for his service. So in the end, what he did was he became a kabuki actor. So, which is a really interesting career path. He also acted as a professional rakugo teller. Rakugo, of course, is the Japanese traditional storytelling. He made a fortune by introducing new repertoires, his adaptation of Oliver Twist in Japanese fashion. So he made an instant hit, and so he used the stage name of Kairakute Braku. Braku obviously means black. But anyway, he also became sort of like an entrepreneur for many of these talents working in Tokyo and Osaka region, and that is why that Geisberg contacted him in advance to help him out to have this talent needed for this recording business. So Geisberg, in his later autobiography, He said Mr. Black was an Englishman married to a Japanese lady, and blah blah blah. Naturally, as he spoke both English and Japanese with equal fluency, he was a godsend to us. So he was like, so he obviously played a very pivotal role in this record making. And the Japanese records were among the highest sellers of the gramophone offerings, gramophone Asian recording offerings at the time. So he also, of course, made arrangements to sell the gramophones and its disc for many places, many establishments, many general stores that he frequented, via several trading companies in Tokyo and Osaka. And there has been quite a lot of interesting, since he is so interesting, there has been quite a lot of books and even PhD dissertations about this individual, coming from, I think, University of Adelaide in Australia. So I strongly encourage you to check it out. It's all online, available online.
Was the gramophone expensive? So the rich
yeah, it was, but it was still a luxury item at this point. But later on, of course, it being slightly cheaper, and it was still cheaper than these phonographs, because problem with these phonographs is that these were made like tanks. You have all these gearings and all these machinery going on. It has, this model alone, you see on top of here, it has 47 patents go with it. So you can imagine how difficult it was to produce it at the time. But so Columbia, after all these big success achieved by the Gramophone company at the time, Columbia decided to enter the Asian market in China, in China and Japan in November 1903. But instead of making recording expedition early on, they decided to have their production facility for gramophones first. So they had the production facility established in Japan, and began to make the localized versions, cheaper versions of these machines to sell to the general public. Of course, since they used the same technology, of course, it was also quite compatible to play the gramophone disc on it. So naturally, that was their way to go. So to counter this heavy attempt from Columbia, their bitter rival, the Gramophone company decided to have this division of the Asian market with its American affiliate, the Victor Talking Machine Company, because they didn't want to have any kind of unwanted competition to sell their products in between. So in this initial negotiation, Victor would have sales rights for China, Indochina, and the Philippines, whereas the Gramophone company would have India and Japan. So in Korea at this time was still relatively untapped market, so they had no negotiations about it at the time. But eventually the Korea was thought to be a viable market in the end. So in early 1904, finally Columbia decided to have two recording engineers by the name of Charles Carson and Harry Marker. So these people were brought over to initially to China first, and they went back and forth between Shanghai and Osaka, and they just made about thousands of recordings between these countries. So they were dispatched to these regions, and as for the China, we don't have any surviving documentations about their activities, because unlike Victor, where they still have the enormous amount of paper trail, Columbia went bankrupt first in the early 1930s, and they destroyed the entire files. So, which means that we don't really have that much of information about their activities before the 1930s. But sometime between thanks to the we know about this because Harry Marker in his later years actually gave a lot of interviews for several researchers who were interested in early history of early sound recordings, and according to him, and there are a couple of other Japanese sources and advertisements and newspaper clippings and so forth, and we know because of that, we know that sometime between November 1905 and February 1906, these duo were in Osaka, and they were making about 1,000 recordings of Japanese music. And when they were doing it, we don't know how it was actually done, but somehow somebody brought over 2 Korean singers by the name of one was by the name of Han In-ho, who was a specialist in Gyeonggi region, Gyeonggi folk song kind of an artist, and Choi Hong-mei was a key-sing. So these two, and these people were accompanied by at least three instrumentalists. So we have 5 different Korean musicians brought over to Osaka. We still don't know who actually made these arrangements, but anyway, they actually made it. So they eventually made 30 size of Korean folk songs, making their recordings to be the very first commercial recordings of Korean music ever recorded. But these recordings were never not put to sale until about a full year later, in March of 1903. And by this time, Victor, as we'll see later, had already issued their offerings already. So it came now it's sort of like a second recording to be released. So among these 30 titles of recordings that they produced, we have about 10 of them still reported, all in each unique. All of these things are unique copies. There are no other second copies of these things. And like the archive I represent, the Korean 78 RPM discographical archive, that we have this website in the database. I strongly encourage you to go Google it. But we have in our archive we have 8 of them, and the other 2, these 2 on each side, these surfaced as photographs. Like it appeared on auction websites, and it was definitely sold to someone, but we don't know who got it. So these are the only remnants of it, and it has been never surfaced ever since. So we have 8 recordings of them, but all of these 8 recordings were put on a CD on their centennial in 2007. So you can actually get these CDs in online shops and so forth. So let's hear one snippet from one of these recordings here. So here's the one over there. That's Yusanga, another very popular folk song of the period. It's impossible to understand because, as you can see, it's really dismal in sound quality because what the problem with Columbia recordings of the period was that, this company totally lacked any their recording equipment was incapable of making a decent human voice recording. They were very targeted. Their recording machines were initially recording for the instrumental music, and they were it was such a dismal failure that not just this one, but basically every Columbia recordings made at this time, U.S. and European recordings and the like, they all sound terribly dismal like this. But don't get up from your seats because we are going to listen some very decent ones later on in our lecture. So, going back to 1904 again, as Columbia's activities definitely put some thread in the Orient in their eyes of the Gramophone and Typewriter Company. They finally decided to have a second major recording expedition to counter with their activities. But the problem was, so Victor sends George C. Cheney to China in late 1904, making about 1,000 recordings up to 1905. But GNT also decided to dispatch their own recording engineer to the Orient. The problem was, the problem was that these GNT had a massive sales, like both in Russia and Japan at the time, and of course Japan and Russia were having a war. So, but they still wanted to like make some profits out of it, as you can see in this hilarious advertisements. Now that hostilities have been openly commerced between Russia and Japan, we feel sure that it will be interesting to all gramophone users to hear their own homes of their national anthem, war songs, and other patriotic music of the two countries in question. So we are issuing today the undermentioned records, and we may add that these records were actually made in Russia and in Japan, yes they were, by native performers. These, and quote unquote, and these records therefore represent with absolute truth that the national characteristics of these patriotic music of these two nations, who are now opposing each other in the Far East. So they were trying to make some good profits in all parts of the world except these two countries. So they sold Japanese and Russian music at the same time. So, but they were anyway. So they tried to have some like slow approach to it. So, so by 1905, when the conflict was almost over, Victor all of a sudden had second thoughts about Japan's victory. Like it's kind of like a misnomer really, but Japan's victory over Russia in this war, starting in about 1905. So finally, in April 1906, GNT decided to dispatch William Conrad Geisberg, the younger brother of Fred, for the second. Yeah, so the entire company worked for this company, by the way. So Fred for the second major recording expedition in Asia. So Will Geisberg began to make recordings in Calcutta in May of 1906, and basically follows his brother's route. So he basically goes to Delhi, Madras, Bombay, and Rangoon in Burma for the first time, and departs for Japan from Rangoon in late October. Meanwhile, Victor President Eldridge Reeves Johnson, the man over there, like on the right, ordered his staff to get various statistics from, let's say, World Almanac and so forth, all kinds of different sources at the time available at the time to get information about Japan. And he decided to call GNT to the renegotiating table. The reason for it obviously was that Japan now seems to be very viable in their commercial value for these eyes of the U.S. manufacturers, and so here we have excuse me. So at the time there were the Japanese demand for a gramophone skyrocketed during this period, and here's this interesting passage from basically it says it's coming from this trade journal. They had the gramophone industry had their trade journal by the name of Talking Machine Review, and there's this big coverage about the Russo-Japanese War and the Japanese customers, and they basically say that the Japanese are the best customers of the world, as they were always eager to buy any machines or records without questioning and never complained about what they got. So basically, they could get quite a lot of fortune selling these things no matter what. So, and of course, if you go to this little bit of a history lesson here, in 1900, the total value of U.S. export goods to Japan, according to the statistics coming from the U.S. Department of Commerce, was $19 million, which was quite significant already. But by 1905, within 5 years, the total had almost tripled to $52 million, which was almost twice as larger than Argentina, the entire exports to Argentina that U.S. had at the time, and almost as equal as China, which was $56 million at the time. And Korea also, on the other hand, became sort of a relatively noticeable and valuable market to the eyes of the U.S. Manufacturers. So in 1900, they were having revenues of $387,000 in 1900, but within 5 years, it it also went up to like about $1 million, almost slightly larger than Thailand. So obviously they finally decided that like Japanese market is too good to have, to let the GNT have their fun, basically. So Victor expresses their wishes to have Japan to their market share, and in exchange of their shares in Indochina and the Pacific Islands, yes, they actually sold records to Tahiti and Micronesian nations at this early in 1900s. So, and of course, pictured here are, of course, from contemporary cartoons, political cartoons, and of course, so like Uncle Sam obviously is fond of Japan, and I love the third one here. It says, can you read what it says? It says, I want you, so Uncle Sam to Japan, I want you to understand that I'm supposed to stay neutral. So, basically, yeah, but they are still giving quite a lot of funds to it. Of course, we know that. Anyway, so because of all these negotiations, so by the time like Will Geisberg began to make recordings in Japan for the Gramophone company initially, GNT actually accepted this exchange, and Korea at the time was considered to be part of the Japanese market, because keep in mind that this was almost exactly a year after the signing of the USA Treaty. So obviously they figured that Korea was in part the Japanese market. So they decided to give Korea to Japan, to Victor as well. So at the time also the Talking Machine Review, that trade journal, it also mentions about this agreement. It says, Korea has a significance which is somewhat more than political. It must be considered as bearing on the commercial development of Japan. Korea, only a ferry service of 9 hours away, will be able to supply the growing demands for food products and raw material in Japan and keep the profits in Japanese hands. So they actually explain the whole reason for this exchange. So, and of course, Will Geisberg eventually arrived in Seoul and around the 3rd and 4th week of November 1906, and begins to make recordings of Korean music. And of course, he always obviously needed an intermediary, and that intermediary happened to be Homer Herbert, also one of the founding members of this very society that I'm presenting here. So Will Geisberg called Homer B. Herbert to help him out finding Korean musicians and other talents and worthy of recording, and Herbert initially accepts the offer. We don't have any surviving paper trails in the Victor archives, but we actually have this letter that he sent to his parents in December 1906, and this is this letter. It says, "What do you think I've gotten? An agent from the Victor Gramophone came here to make records of all kinds of Korean music." That's hence the name of this lecture. I helped him out find the singers and players. He made over 100 records, and blah blah blah. He gave me a beautiful stroh violin, and you might ask, what is stroh violin? So this is the stroh violin here. I couldn't really find any big picture of this thing. So basically, this is a violin with a horn and a diaphragm attached to it, so that it's very directional. So to make a recording of a violin in early technology, you could actually, because the ordinary violin was simply too soft to be recorded properly. So they created this device with diaphragms and horn attached to it, so that it could be directional and louder. So, and he also says they may want me to handle the gramophone out here through my Korean company. If so, it will pay big stuff. So, quite frank about it. Yeah, so I tried to find about this particular company. Of course, he was working at the time. He had business collaborations with Colburn and Bostwick, the head of the Seoul electric company at the time. For those who don't believe, actually, when this is not the first time this letter had surfaced. There was one Japanese researcher, Yamauchi Fumitaka, who discovered this letter first at the time in 2007. But he made a little bit of minor mistakes in transcribing the word because his handwriting isn't particularly good. But here is the letter. So yeah, for those who want to try by themselves, I can actually send this image to you. Anyway, so this is how the recordings were made. I couldn't really find any contemporary photographs. This is from the 1940s, sort of like a retrospect recreation of it, because at the time, like before, when these things were in use, these were all trade secrets, so they never took pictures of them. But now, in the 1940s, there was no need for it, so there's this attempt. So it's driven by this big chunk of weight, and there's this thick wax tablet, and there's a diaphragm to it, and you shout into this horn, and the diaphragm vibrates, and it's connected with a needle to it, and the needle vibrates, creates this groove, and it's basically, it creates this impression of sound to it. And I'm gonna, of course, we are like, just wait for it, but we are going to demonstrate it later on. So wheel guides were eventually made 36 7-inch size. So when it first started, when gramophone was first invented, the standard size was 7-inch. But in the early 1900s, they decided to expand that slightly longer, so it made 10-inch records. And of course, eventually they couldn't really decide to what to become of the next larger format, so they experimented with 16-inch, 14-inch, but eventually they ended up using 12-inch. So that's the standard LP size today. But 65 10-inch size, and at the time 12-inch was still a very large and expensive format, so they didn't record Korean music on it. In fact, throughout the entire the lifespan of the 70 RPM records in Korea, there was only one 12-inch record to be made. It's actually radio exercise music, so it's kind of boring. But he completes his recording task in Seoul on December 3rd in 1906. We know this because he sent a telegram to head office in London, and we have this telegram, so we are absolutely clear that when he completed his task. After that, since the whole negotiation was over, he was instructed to give these original wax masters all the way to, like, instead of sending it back to England, where he came from, he was instructed to send them over to, like, Victor, to Camden, New Jersey, all the way up from Korea. Imagine how long would it take? But so he shipped all these 101 Korean masters, as well as about 500 wax masters that he recorded in Japan at the time. So they were all shipped back to Camden, New Jersey. This is the Victor recording. The whole building here, like these 16 buildings that you see here, these are the entire Victor facility. Camden, New Jersey. The city of Camden, New Jersey, literally, relied on this entire facility. It had 300,000 employees. So, but anyway, but of course, just a side note, if you go to Camden, New Jersey now, there's only one building in the corner. Everything was completely demolished. They literally dynamited the entire facility in 1967 when they got rid of their recording department. And they literally dynamited the whole thing on a single day and literally tossed the debris in the Delaware River. So, yeah, that's how it was done in the 60s. But anyway, these original wax masters were shipped back to Camden, New Jersey, and during the transit, 5 of them, 4 7-inch records and 1 10-inch record, was either broken or became useless. They got moles on it or whatever. So in the end, eventually, out of 101 discs made at the time, 96 of them were eventually issued. So, and at the time, this was all at the time, records were all only single-sided. So they only had recordings on the one side, just like a CD. But later on, of course, they later developed the 2 double-sided records, starting in 1908. So the reason I know about all these informations about why these things were broken, how these things were broken, what it was issued or whatever, we know this thanks to this piece, this handwritten journal, day-by-day journal kept at the factory, they call it recording ledgers. And these are most of these ledgers do survive, and these are all housed in the Sony archives, Sony archives in New York, Sony Music Group archives, because Sony is the illegal successor to the Victor Talking Machine Company because they bought the assets of it. So this is not the Korean like recording ledger, but there are like still some surviving Korean ledgers. They are like this big, like literally the size of this this screen here. So I couldn't take photographs of it. But I had a number of friends who actually helped me out, a number of researchers who helped me out with it. So they transcribed, some of them helped me out, transcribe these original recording ledgers information. And as you can see, you have the catalog number, like the numbers you see on the label, and the matrix number. The matrix number goes with the actual metal part, metal like stamper. And as you can see, NR, not released. Listed as broken. Of course, this one was broken, and so you have first artist, second artist. Of course, they couldn't read Korean, so they didn't put any names on it, which is which is big blow to my research. But you have something like female fancy drumming, whatever that is. Yeah, but you see kayagum and all kinds of band, drum, and all kinds of interesting stuff. So we still can, by comparing these information on the surviving recording ledger and some surviving discs, we can actually reconstruct to a certain degree of how, what kind of repertoire and music were recorded by Victor at the time. Of course, you don't really need to do that guesswork if you have the original catalog. The only known copy of this Korean Victor record catalog was owned by this Japanese individual collector by the name of Yamaguchi Kamenosuke in the 1930s. And just for a teaser, he actually included it in his book. He wrote this a little brief history of the record, history of recording, and sort of like a collector's guide and so forth. In that book from 1936. There's this like 2 photocopies of this catalog that he owned. That's what he included here. However, this copy, along with all of his collection, all of his record collection, were completely destroyed during the air raid in Tokyo. So we don't have it. However, I recently, just about 3 months ago actually, had discovered a near complete listing. At least all 64 10-inch issued sides, like the entire catalog of it, in a private collection. And I'm working on it. I'm not disclosing any of it today, because I'm still working on a journal. But a journal article I'm writing a journal article right now about this new discovery, as well as a couple of other findings since I did since I wrote an article about this, like 1906 recordings back in 2015. So, but these Korean Victor records were shipped to Korea in January of 1907, and these were handled by the Gramophone company. Gramophone was actually a separate company, but Victor bought it out to eliminate the competition and repurposed it as sort of like a budget label, so it was like cheaper records. So Victor's budget subsidiary, anyway, so which also dealt with sales of Chinese records. So they were a bit cautious when they were trying to sell these records for the first time to this untapped market. But and there has been a reference to these records that appears on several Korean newspaper articles in around March of 1907. Harbert, however, who were so eager to sell these things, was liquidating his properties starting in February 1907 because, as we all know, Kojong gave him a secret mission to support the king's secret emissaries to The Hague. So by May 1907, Harbert left the country for good. He visited the country twice after that, but before eventually coming for the final visit in 1949, which killed him. But anyway, so he was gone for good by late 1907. So eventually, a Japanese company, a trading company by the name of Ori Trading Company, or Jikosangwe in Korean, is a Japanese-owned company in Seoul, took over the distribution of these records up to 1912. And initially, this company was actually a subsidiary of another bigger trading company by the name of Sale and Fraser. Remember Fraser? So this is initially the very company that was established by our old friend Everett Fraser, who introduced this very technology to Korea for the first time. So it's kind of interesting coincidence here. So, but partial evidence suggests that less than 1,200 copies, a very tiny number of records, of copies of Victor Korean records, I mean all 100 titles combined, were sold to Korea up to 1910. We know this because we have some partial statistics coming from the Victor archives as well as the Department of Commerce. They say they got the gross revenue of $720. And assuming they were sold for 60 cents each, it means it translates to about 1,200 copies. So this was 60 cents each. But of course, 60 cents back then, it's nothing to us, but at the time it was still relatively large sum of money. And in Korea at the time, it was like roughly the equivalent of 3.5 won, which was almost is equal of the annual school fee, school tuition. So this was a big money for just one single-sided record. So if you want to have 10 selections, then you will have 35 won, which is your annual income almost. So this was very expensive. And not only that.
5 minutes.
Okay. So. And the Nippon Open Company, the first very true gramophone and record manufacturer established in Japan, they began to sell in cheaper price of Korean selections in 1911. And the Gramophone Company got entangled with some legal trouble, so they have to forced to liquidate their assets in 1912. And of course, that obviously it resulted the discontinuing of the Korean products in 1912. So still, nevertheless, even though there were like dismal commercial failures, they were like quite historically and culturally significant in many ways. The first, obviously, this was very first commercial sound recording ever recorded in Korea, and features over 50 different individual musicians, and features a variety of regional music over 10 different places, including Seoul, Gimhae, Icheon, Cheongju, and Pyongyang, and all these other different places. So, and it also provides a very unique and fascinating glimpse into the musical environment and taste of the late Joseon era. So, and you might ask, when you think about the traditional music as we know it, I mean, we instantly think about pansori first. But if you go through the entire selections provided by the company, there are only 3 pansori selections there. And a lot of them are like folk songs and shijo singing, folk instrumental ensembles, which you don't hear anymore, and royal procession music, festival music, etc. And a lot of these music literally got extinct. Like it's no longer to be performed. It has no like written resources about them, making these recordings to be only extant recordings of these types of music. So finally, we now have some samples here, and you'll be surprised how nice several of these recordings sound like. So first of all, we have Yeoksa Taeyong. Definitely a big improvement over the Columbia, isn't it? And here's the Hwangsil Dechita, Imperial Dechita, which is probably the only authentic recording of a royal procession music played by the royal musicians. It's very loud, actually. And I'm skipping the punctuatory one because we're running out of time, but I have this absolute favorite of 9, which is Dogfight Invitation.
You can play it.
Okay.
You have Brother Anthony's blessing.
Okay. Yeah, but we can actually play. Yeah, okay. Then the earliest punctuatory recording in existence.
Wow.
Oh. And this is from the University of Hawaii collection, and it's in very rough shape. But I managed to make it very, managed to restore the sound. The singer made several recordings, hundreds of recordings up to the 1930s, but this is arguably his earliest recording. And as you can see, there's A here, which indicates there's a two-part. This is a two-part recording, but it's like the second part is still missing, and we're still searching for it. And finally, my absolute favorite, the dogfight imitation. So this is a vocal imitation of a dogfight, and rendered by a vocal artist, which is identified as Koja Degam, or Master Eunuch. I don't know what that means. We know nothing about this individual. But obviously, there has been quite a lot of early recorded repertoire in Ripon catalogs and everything, so that that features several like similar stuffs like dogfight, cockfight, all kinds of things, like bird imitations. So, so this obviously suggests that this sort of like vocal imitation was a very popular like form of entertainment at the time. But I'm only, of course, playing you a snippet. But yeah, it's a blowout. So.
How long is the entire?
Like 3.5 minutes. And at the last minute, just before the group ends, there's a very distinctive chuckle. Somebody was laughing out hysterically, but like I didn't include it.
Commercial.
What?
Release, like.
What did you say?
So like that was meant to be a commercial
Oh, yeah,
release. Like they were like, oh, this is gonna sell so many copies.
You know what? We have found 3 copies of this. Yeah, this is like, yeah, obviously was a huge seller. But yeah, well, whatever. So anyway, so prior to 2014, before I went to the States for the first time, like for my exchange student bit, there were only 11 titles, each in unique copies, and my archive, our archive actually owns 5 out of 11. But since 2014, when I went to the to study for exchange student for a first semester, I have located additional 15 copies of these records. 13 of them are unique, and 2 of them are duplicates in various archives and collections in U.S. and elsewhere, and making the whole total on the surviving Korean Victor titles to be 24, which is about 1/4 of it. So we still need to find, I mean, 3/3 of it, 3/4 of it, but it's, you know, it's a good start, I would say. So the National Gugak Center also, 국립국악원 also had a special concert in September 2016 when they performed reconstructions of these royal procession music, the piece you just heard. and captured the Victor disc discovered by me. So I'm gonna play a little bit of that. It's like 12 minutes long, but I'm gonna play a little bit of that. Oh,
It takes time.
okay.
It's coming.
Wait.
It's coming, it's coming, it's coming.
Wait.
Yeah, it's coming.
It's full screen. It's full screen. Relax.
용금이라 대치타!
Well, so much for that. So, where can I go back to? Like, I have to go back to the PowerPoint.
Somewhere.
You can, lecture's over.
There it is. No, is it? No. I'll just do this. So, and finally, I have to make this very important announcement before I finish and do this demonstration. A CD reissue of every available Victor recordings from 1906 is currently being used within this year, presumably in the first half of this year. So, and this will be, unfortunately, we are not reissuing for for commercial purposes. We are donating these CDs it's a not for sale thing, but we will be donating these things to institutions, colleges, libraries, and RAS. Yeah, yeah, I will do that. So anyway, so that's the end of my lecture, and yeah, I thank you for joining me today. But don't get up from your seats because I'm going to do a little bit of a demonstration. It will only take about 5 minutes. So 5. So, as I said earlier, you can make a recording on this machine by. So the thing you do is to change the heads. This is a reducer, which is a playing. But there is a separate thing called this is a recorder. This is 110-year-old stock. It's inside the box. It's in pristine condition. And usually these things do not survive at all, but this thing somehow managed to do it. So here's the recorder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this thing. And of course you can record it over a pre-existing cylinder, but this is a blank cylinder. Just like blank cassettes, they made blank cylinders back in the day. They're still making them.
So that's not 100 years old.
Yeah, this is like a new stock from about 3 years ago. But this box is 100 years old. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is winding this machine to the fullest capacity. It will run for about 20 minutes for a single winding, which is amazing. Just a single little spring inside. But anyway, I'll put this blank. Notice how I touch this thing. You cannot touch it because you leave fingerprints on it. This is basically a metallic soap. So if you touch them on the surface, you make fingerprints mark all over the place. So, ooh. switch it to the recorder here. Right. So I asked two of my friends here to volunteer for this occasion. So can you come over, please?
Jacko?
No, Jennifer.
No, I was.
Actually, I've got a friend here, Samia, who's an actual singer from New York.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay.
In the
So.
meantime, I would like to chastise the other members of the RAS for when being asked who was the loudest member.
So okay. So what's your name again? Samia. Okay. So I will start with you first, and please, before you sing, please recite, today's like the date of this, day, and just and name and sing whatever you want. And we have a maximum amount of 2 minutes, and we have another person waiting for us. So it should be short and loud. And so
You want me to, sing
So
something
you-
short and loud.
show them loud.
All right.
And so I will say, when I say this, you go, like, you have to be right in front of here. Like,
Okay.
you literally put your face here.
Okay.
Okay?
You're not close. You really put your whole face.
He hasn't started it yet,
One,
but when he does, I
two,
will.
3.
It's January 23rd, 2018. My name is Samia Mounts. And I am telling you, I'm not going. You're the best man I'll ever know. There's no way I could ever go. Darling, there's no way. No, 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 no way I'm living without you. I'm not living without you. I don't wanna be free. I'm staying, you and you're gonna love me. Bonus points if you can name that musical.
So before we do start the second section selection, notice how many wax cutting you hear. This is called swerve. You have to. You probably noticed that I was constantly blowing the whole thing because it is creating quite a mess here. But after I cleaned this thing a little bit,
And that was way better than Jacko.
we have about a minute.
Hey, you never heard me sing.
Call it a hunch.
This is kind of
I never will.
difficult to just. Okay. We're running out of time. This is the second time I do this. Hopefully this will be better. Anyway. Somebody has to have some vacuum cleaner here after this. So I go back. Put the producer back in place. I definitely need to have brought my brush, but unfortunately I forgot about it. But